It is a very chilly -18 degrees in Ottawa this morning, but that isn't stopping all the journalists from camping out in front of Rideau Hall to try and get the first glimpse of who is going to be a part of Justin Trudeau's inner circle. Good morning, I'm Katie Simpson, and this is a special Cabinet Shuffle edition of Power and Politics. The Prime Minister is changing the makeup of his inner circle this morning. It stems from an announcement late last week from longtime MP Scott Bryson. The President of the Treasury Board is not seeking re-election this fall, and that decision creates a big hole to fill in the Trudeau cabinet. And of course, that is what has brought us to today. Over the next couple of hours, we'll show you who's being added to cabinet, and we'll talk about the reasons why. And joining me to help make sense of all of this is Chris Hall, host of CBC Radio's The House, and CBC polls analyst Eric Grenier. Chris, I want to start with you. I know that you've been working the phones all through the weekend, chatting with sources. Can you set the table for us right now? What do we know about what's expected in the next 45 minutes?
Okay, the first thing that we're expecting is that we'll be 5 people that are being put into cabinet. This is, as you noted, precipitated by the departure of Scott Bryson. We understand that, and are reporting and have been since last night, that Jane Philpott will move to replace Scott Bryson at Treasury Board. She has been moved before to fill in situations that are seen as difficult or even a crisis. In this case, Treasury Board is a really important, although somewhat less high-profile position to try and get money going, money flowing into the economy as we head into an election year. Seamus O'Regan will replace her at Indigenous Affairs, we understand. And we're also hearing Jody Wilson-Raybould, who is the Justice Minister, is likely to move to replace O'Regan at Veterans, and that David Leonetti, who is a MP from the Montreal area, La Salle-Mar, I think it's the old riding of Paul Martin, will be moved to Justice Minister. I'm still waiting to hear what the 5th person might be, but clearly there's an effort here to try to bolster a couple of areas in advance of the election campaign. So
we've been talking about Jane Philpott for about the past 24 hours. Actually, I believe David Cochrane had reported last week that she was sort of the front runner to fill that position. But what is new this morning is this information about Jody Wilson-Raybould moving from, Minister of Justice, Attorney General to Veterans Affairs. Well, Veterans Affairs is, of course, a hugely important file. What do you make of that decision to move her from that portfolio to the other?
Yeah, it's at best, I would call it a lateral move. Justice Minister, very important. She's been responsible in part with Jane Philpott for introducing the physician-assisted death legislation and for legalizing cannabis. So the suggestion here is that is there a problem to be addressed, or is this just a move to decide? Clearly, Jody Wilson-Raybould, being from British Columbia, very important. She is Indigenous, which is a clearly important part of the difficulties that the government is facing now with pipelines, for example. We saw with the Prime Minister's town hall in Kamloops last week in British Columbia. So that move is interesting. Not sure what to make of it at this point, but as I said, at best, it would be seen to be a lateral move.
And Eric, I want to bring you in. Heading into, we of course are in an election year, and everything we talk about has to be viewed in that lens. What can a cabinet shuffle do in an election year? Can it do anything to help a party in power?
Well, I don't think there's any sort of cabinet shuffle bump or anything like that, but I think what it does do is it gives the government an opportunity to have a last chance to tweak things, to maybe do some upgrades, to make some changes that could have a good impact on an election campaign. But from what we know, this was not an expected shuffle. They were not planning to do this. So the fact that we see such a pretty high-profile move in Jody Wilson-Raybould suggests that they thought that something needed to be addressed going forward into the election, that their messaging on certain policies maybe was starting to hurt them. Now, Seamus O'Regan did have some issues on the veterans file just recently, so they might have seen this as a bit of a weakness, because it had been a weakness for the Conservatives in the 2015 election. So it might be that this is one of those issues they want to make sure does not have any other problems going forward for the rest of this election year.
And Chris, that's what I want to ask you about. We know that Seamus O'Regan, particularly of late, has had a very challenging time on this file, and he was really pilloried by members of the veterans community after he says he wasn't trying to compare his experience leaving broadcast journalism into other endeavors to what it's like to leave the military, but it was certainly perceived that way by members of the military community. How significant, do you think that had hurt Seamus O'Regan in his role at Veterans Affairs?
Well, look, as you know, heading into an election campaign, but even just generally speaking, communications is an absolute key. Someone has to be a good communicator to be effective in any portfolio they hold. That was a misstep for Seamus O'Regan, but I don't think it's diminished his reputation inside the cabinet for being an effective communicator. He's very good on his feet. This was a mistake, one he apologized for afterwards. And we've talked about this in the past, Katie. It's also important that you have a personal connection with the Prime Minister. He has to be comfortable with you. Clearly, clearly he and Seamus O'Regan have a long history together, and that's one of the reasons that I think he's being moved, is to get away from the problems that might have existed in Indigenous, in veterans, and move him into Indigenous services, where Jane Philpott has really laid the groundwork. We're expecting very important legislation at the end of the month when the House resumes, dealing with transferring responsibility for child care and child services to some of the First Nations and Indigenous groups. So he will be the one now spearheading and shepherding that move.
That is something that I definitely want to bring up, because Jane Philpott has been known sort of as the minister. She's been a very high performer in this cabinet, known to get stuff done. That's sort of been her mandate. She was a very strong performer when she was the Minister of Health. She did have a little bump in the road when there was that limo issue early on in the mandate, but she was able to recover and really focus on the work, it seems, and really focus on achieving goals. And that was part of the reason we all understood is why she was put in as Indigenous Service Minister, because she can really focus on something and get it done, and maybe not necessarily, keep your head down under the radar and just get things done along the way.
Yeah, exceptionally efficient at what she did. I mentioned Jody Wilson-Raybould being responsible for cannabis and physician-assisted death. Oh,
and Chris, I'm just going to interrupt you for a quick second. We got some people arriving. Janice McGregor is our reporter who's on the scene right now at Rideau Hall. Sorry to interrupt you there. Janice, who are you seeing right now?
Yeah, nobody yet, actually. The cars are starting to pull up. Yeah, there's no new ministers yet. It's just the Tinchuk there. So not quite sure what to make of that. But anyway, we watch and see. But so yeah, we haven't had any... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, set the scene for us, Janice. What's going on there at Rideau Hall?
Yeah, so like I said, we haven't had any limos or cabs pull up with potential shuffled ministers or future ministers, people getting promotions today. But it's a beautiful day for a cabinet shuffle. It's going to be nice and sunny, although it's a crisp -17. We have a podium here where Prime Minister is going to come out afterwards and make a few words. So kind of a lot to look forward to in addition to the ceremony itself. But yeah, it's always kind of exciting this stage, right? Because the cars pull up and you never know who's going to pop out. So it's kind of hard because my back's to it, but we've got some good people who are going to keep their eyes peeled for me and be the eyes in the back of my head, so to speak.
Okay, and I believe that might be a deputy minister. They've gone in the door. So you know what? When people come in and come and go, that's sort of the excitement of cabinet shuffle day, is spotting the who, the where, the what, and it's those unexpected people that pop up. But you mentioned Walter Tinchuk is there. Janice, could that have anything to do with perhaps the shuffle at Veterans Affairs? Could that be maybe a line of support there?
Yeah, don't know. Your guess is as good as mine, although he is a well-known and previously very well-loved, right? Senior leader in the forces. So I am not sure what to make of that, although I agree it's very interesting to see him go in.
Oh, okay. And so Chris...
I'm pretty sure he's a deputy minister of Veterans Affairs, so the sign that he is there, and we now know that Veterans Affairs for certain is being shuffled. That would be why Walter Tinchuk is there. So an indication, and as we see some other cars pulling up, that they're getting ready to go, and the ministers will be immediately briefed by their deputies as soon as they take on their new responsibilities.
Yeah, and I know that we've all covered a lot of these, and it's those moments when the ministers first come out, and I remember Jim Carr, when he had been last cabinet shuffle, when he had been appointed to his new role, moving into international trade. People were meeting him and saying, "Okay, it's a very step by step, and it's and now we're going to brief you." And you try and catch up with the ministers as they're walking out to try and ask them a couple of questions, and it's very like, nope, staff need to pull you in and need to brief you in there. So we're going to keep our eye on Rideau Hall. So Janice, if you see anyone you recognize, let us know immediately, and we will of course go back there. We'll keep an eye on the arrivals here.
That looked like the clerk.
Yeah, the clerk of the Privy Council just arrived, my people tell me, so.
Okay, so we're still a good, at least more than half an hour until this is officially expected to get underway. And we know that we'd been reporting throughout this process that this is expected to be a smaller shuffle. This was not something that's planned. We heard that, we heard through David Cochran's reporting earlier that Scott Bryson went to the Prime Minister before Christmas, said, look, I'm not going to run in 2019. I think it's better if I resign from Cabinet. So you you have your toughest members, you have a full front bench going into this next election.
But interesting, Katie, that it's not just to replace Scott Bryson. There seems to be more here, and trying to understand why, for example, if Jody Wilson-Raybould's moving, what that portends. To go back to the question you asked me before we went to Janice around Jane Philpott, she has been really critical, not just only in dealing with the opioid crisis when she was health minister, but also in helping to shepherd through some of those changes to the law with physician-assisted death and the like. So she has been seen to be a very effective communicator, quietly efficient, well regarded within the bureaucracy and by her cabinet colleagues. So moving her up to, as I said, a relatively low profile in terms of public position, but absolutely critical in ensuring that money starts to flow. Like, for example, for social housing, for infrastructure work. That is roughly that is the mandate of the Treasury Board president, to ensure that money is spent and spent effectively and in a way that can be seen to be transparent and accountable. And
one other thing that she'll also be dealing with alongside Carla Qualtrough, assuming Carla Qualtrough is not being moved, and there's no indication she's going to be moving, is that she's going to have some sort of say in what's going on with the Phoenix pay system. And that is something that we had talked about for, I think it's a good 2 solid years now. It's still a problem. It's still an issue. And although it's mostly Carla Qualtrough's mandate, given that she is sort of leading the federal public service, that's something that she is also going to have to deal with as well. Eric, I want to bring you in again. When we take a look at where we're hearing these moves are going to be, Veterans Affairs, the Treasury Board, a change at the Attorney General's level, does that indicate to you that these are the trouble spots the government foresees heading into the next election?
Well, these aren't the ones that we would have guessed that they would be the trouble spots, because for the trouble spots, we've been talking a lot about immigration. I believe that's David Linetti there.
It is David Linetti.
There is David Linetti. So
I would suggest he is indeed one of the people being shuffled.
And
that sigh of relief you hear is from me.
I was going to say, as we watch him walk in right now, Chris, tell us what you've learned about what we're expecting to see at 8:45.
Well, David Linetti has been the Innovation Parliamentary Secretary and has been widely regarded within the community of innovators, the new sort of technologies, for being very effective, listening to their issues and effectively communicating them both to the minister and to the government. He is a former law prof at McGill University. He is from Montreal, La Salle-Mar, and that indicates, like, this is not also filling a hole in Nova Scotia created by Scott Bryson's departure, but trying to elevate someone who's been clearly seen to be a strong performer in a very key portfolio. Justice Minister, Attorney General, obviously you were responsible for drafting the laws and making sure that they conform to, any new legislation conforms to the Charter and other things, but also a very important role in just in terms of the public face of the federal government as we look through criminal code changes and those kinds of things.
He's bilingual, but it is a big promotion for someone from Parliamentary Secretary to that level. So it is quite a jump for David Linetti. And it is on the island of Montreal, which is an interesting move. Those wouldn't be seats that the Liberals would be particularly concerned about, but the wider Montreal area is certainly going to be an important one for the Liberals.
And he's certainly going to have an interesting decision on his plate coming up in the next few months, given over time, because it is the Attorney General who will have to make the decision about the Huawei extradition. And that is something that there is a lot of sensitivity around. And so whether that is one of the biggest priorities for the government right now, trying to deal with the ongoing escalation of tensions with China. And so that decision is going to be something that is very key for that person to make. And it's interesting that Jody Wilson-Raybould is being shuffled out as that very, very important decision needs to be made. But you brought up something, Chris, that we haven't talked about yet, and that is Nova Scotia. Scott Bryson is a well-known, long-time MP and cabinet minister from Nova Scotia. Right now, we're waiting to find out if someone from Nova Scotia will be tapped to make sure that there is representation from Nova Scotia in cabinet. Any ideas where that could go?
Our French language colleagues at Radio Canada indicate that they've been confirmed that there are 5 people changing. So somebody is coming in from Nova Scotia, and there'll be 2 reasons for that. Nova Scotia is very important. Obviously, the Liberals hold every seat in Atlantic Canada, but Scott Bryson represented a rural riding, and I think that's a big key here because many of the ministers who are in his cabinet, Trudeau's cabinet right now, come from urban areas. So the 2 people whose names we've been hearing most often are Bernadette Jordan. She represents South Shore St. Margaret's, which is the southern shore of Nova Scotia, or Sean Fraser, who's Central Nova. Both of them were long-time Conservative seats before the last election campaign. There is a gender balance issue that Bernadette Jordan, maybe that leans her way. The issue is, what are they going to create for him or her to get them into cabinet? They're obviously going to need to have a new portfolio, because as we've seen so far, we can actually trace the 4 people who are moving and they're filling each other's positions.
And speaking of the gender balance, heading into this cabinet shuffle, it's 17 and 17 plus the Prime Minister. And Justin Trudeau has made that a very important position for his government, to make sure that there is gender balance within cabinet, to sort of set an example, and he's made it a part of his agenda. Eric, let's talk about Atlantic Canada, the eastern part of the country. The Liberals, when they won, they swept all red across Atlantic Canada, the Maritimes. It's all red. There has to be someone from Nova Scotia coming into cabinet. There's no way they're not going to fill it. How important is it going to be for the Liberals to try and hold on to the power that they have right now in the East?
I think it's...
Oh, just one second. There's Jane Philpott. Oh, she's coming in. I wonder if she has anything to say as she heads on in. Janice, is she speaking to reporters?
Yeah, she's saying that she's looking forward to speaking to us afterwards.
So Jane Philpott, as we have been reporting, David Cochrane confirmed last night that she will be moving from her position as the Minister of Indigenous Services into the role of the President of the Treasury Board. And so there we go, as she heads on into Rideau Hall. And as you mentioned, you know, when you report these things and you learn these things, Chris, there's a sigh of relief when you see them walk in, to make sure you were right and the information that you had was good. And it looks like the cameras are getting in position for someone else to... Seamus O'Regan, we're being told, is arriving right now. And as, again, we have been reporting for at least 24 hours on CBC News, that he will be shuffled as well. We're just listening in to see if he's going to say anything, if we can pick up anything.
Away for the cameras. Our colleague Chris Rands.
Chris Rands making sure everyone gives a jaunty wave before they head on in. But the ministers, of course, don't really say much on their way in, but they do come out and typically answer questions on their way out. So as we have been reporting, Seamus O'Regan is moving. But Eric, I want to get back to that question I was asking you just a short time ago. How important is it for the Liberals to try and hold on to as much support as they can heading into this election, particularly in the eastern part of the country?
That's right. They won all 32 seats, and no one expects that they'll be able to hold all 32 of them. New Brunswick is one of the provinces where they're expected to really have some difficulty holding some of those long-time Conservative seats. Nova Scotia is one of those interesting places. Kings Hants, a riding like Scott Bryson's, used to vote Conservative. If it's no longer Scott Bryson on the ballot, how will that riding go? And for a riding like Central Nova, that used to be Peter MacKay's old riding. That is certainly one of the ones that the Liberals would be concerned about. So they're expecting to have some losses in Atlantic Canada, in Ontario, in Western Canada. So to not lose a few extra seats in Nova Scotia would really help the government at this stage. So it would be a shock if they didn't have representation. Every province has representation in cabinet, including PEI, including Alberta, where the Liberals have fewer seats than they have in PEI. Those provinces still have cabinet representation.
Imagine, too, New Brunswick actually has 2 cabinet ministers, and Nova Scotia didn't have one at all. I think that would be very problematic. But, you know, as Eric was pointing out, the Conservatives and the Liberals are very strong in Nova Scotia, have been. They flipped these seats. So Central Nova, Peter MacKay. Gerald Keddy was the long-serving MP for St. Margaret's, South Shore St. Margaret's. I got to get that right. So you send some signals with who you put in about to what extent, is it going to be someone who's from the rural areas? To what extent they will be the face? One of the things we haven't mentioned that's a possibility would be ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, now rests with Navdeep Bains, the Innovation Minister. A lot of criticism in the House of Commons that the minister responsible for Atlantic Canada has a seat in Toronto. So if they're adding a person to the cabinet from Nova Scotia, that would be, it would seem to me, the most likely position to put her in, or him in.
Okay, and just a reminder to our viewers, you are watching a special cabinet shuffle edition of Power and Politics. I'm Katie Simpson here with Chris Hall, Eric Grenier, and Janice McGregor is on the ground at Rideau Halls for us. We're also broadcasting on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So if you do have questions, we'll try to answer some of them over the next couple of hours. Our handle is at PNPCBC on Twitter. On Facebook, we're at CBC Politics, and you can find us on the CBC News page on YouTube. Samantha Collier, this is a question from YouTube, is asking us, When was the last time a Canadian Prime Minister shuffled cabinet, and why was it done? Chris, would you like to answer that one?
Well, the last time was last summer when we made some changes. I'm not sure I can't remember what the actual reason was for it, but the general feeling is that Prime Ministers want to address some regional weaknesses or address some of the issues around communicating on important files, and sometimes it's just to present a fresh face. This late in a mandate, it usually has to do with trying to plug a hole or trying to make sure that on issues that might be really critical in your re-election campaign that you have the best performers in the right positions. In this case, clearly Scott Bryson's departure was a big part of that and finding someone to replace him in Atlantic Canada, but clearly as well it gave them an opportunity to try to make a shuffle and to address what might have been a concern with the Justice Department or might have been concern with Veterans Affairs.
And Eric, I want to ask you, we haven't heard anything about anyone from Alberta at this point. Given the problems that the Liberals have right now in Alberta, given some of the criticism around Amarjeet Sohi and whether he's been able to effectively communicate on his file, are you surprised we're not necessarily seeing some change around Alberta? I know everything is not set in stone at this point and there's lots of room for surprises today, but given the problems the Liberals have in Alberta, are you not surprised to see something around that?
I think one of the issues is they just don't have many options. They have 3 MPs now. Darshan Kang is no longer sitting with the Liberal caucus. Kent Hare was booted out of cabinet, and so what's left is Amarjeet Sohi, who has natural resources. That is the file. That is more or less the Alberta file at this stage. And Randy Wassenaw is the only other Liberal MP. There had been some talk that maybe he would have been someone who was shuffled in last time, but that didn't happen. To move Sohi, that could still happen. We'll have to wait and see, but that would be a big signal from the government.
Okay, we've got a limo arriving right now. Some of the cameras and reporters are kind of in the way, but that's the fun of a cabinet shuffle. We have to peer through. Here we go. Okay, who is it going to be? Jody Wilson-Raybould. So, Chris, you're right. Jody Wilson-Raybould is in for a shuffle. Let's just listen to see if she says anything. She's waving to the cameras, but waved the wrong way. There you go. So Jody Wilson-Raybould, as you've been reporting, Chris, she's on the move from the Ministry of Justice, Attorney General, to Veterans Affairs.
Yeah, as I said, it's an interesting, and we will, I'm sure, dissect this more. But clearly, the Veterans Affairs is very important. Seamus O'Regan has had a few problems there, as you mentioned earlier, with the communication around the sensitivity of the veterans' issues. If she's moving there, maybe that's a sign that they feel she can do a better job there. On the other hand, David Linetti being put into Justice, maybe there's a concern that the Justice Department needed to shake up as well. These are things that we'll get a sense of, I think, in greater detail later on. But it is a surprise, because if you were simply just trying to fill for Scott Bryson, you could do that by making one move. This is more than one move, so clearly the Prime Minister is sending some kind of signal about one or both of those departments and the need for having somebody new at the top.
I was going to say, this is something that, as we have been speaking about, this is something that was unexpected. Scott Bryson going to the Prime Minister before Christmas saying, look, I'm not going to run, I'm going to resign from Cabinet, and then the Prime Minister saying, hey, take Christmas, think about it, come back in the new year, and if you're still feeling that way, okay, then we'll deal with it.
Prime Ministers generally ask Cabinet ministers if they're running again, and if they're not, to let them know so they can make those kinds of changes. With Scott Bryson, it was a bit different. As you said, our colleague David Cochrane suggesting that the Prime Minister asked him to reconsider, or at least to consider more fully over the Christmas period whether he wanted to leave, and he ultimately came back and said he did. He's got two young children who'll be starting school in the fall and wants to spend some time there. There's also issues around the Norman affair and to what extent
that's
there
what
was
I want
an
to
involvement
ask you about.
with the department that Scott Bryson was heading, whether he had in some way, these are questions that were raised in the House of Commons, whether he had in some way been involved in influencing the decision. Certainly he is on the witness list for the Norman trial, and the defense is saying, well, we have some questions for him as well. So I'm not sure that is the overarching thing, but clearly it was in the back of the minds that this does give them an opportunity so Scott Bryson doesn't have to stand up in the House of Commons and answer these questions.
And that's sort of another question. It leads to another question. When Justin Trudeau shuffled his cabinet last August, that was thought to be, okay, this is going to be the front bench going into the election. These are sort of the power players that are going to get in there and be the strong campaigners to help lead the Liberals to what they want, which ultimately is another majority government. Given that Bryson didn't raise his concerns at that point, and we learned that he did raise them over Christmas, do you think that the Norman affair has had an effect on this?
Yeah, it's hard to know, but it has to have had some role. I take him at his word that he wants to spend time with his family, that he's been a politician now for 22 years. That's a very long time to be commuting back and forth between Ottawa and your home. But I think that in the back of people's minds, that has to be one of the considerations. Scott Bryson, to be fair, has denied any improper activity, any influence whatsoever. But as we know through the House of Commons and question period, that this was a theme, at least for about a 2-week period, about what was his role, what interference might there have been. So I think that had to be at the back of both his mind and perhaps the Prime Minister's.
Eric, what does it do for the Liberals to lose such a well-known Nova Scotian when they go to campaign in Nova Scotia during the federal election next year, or this year?
I think it does hurt them to lose someone like Scott Bryson, but not only among Nova Scotian voters, but also the old PC voters, the voters who might have drifted over to the Liberals when the Progressive Conservatives and Canadian Alliance joined forces in 2003. Scott Bryson, he was a PC MP. He crossed the floor to the Liberals. So he was one of the standard bearers of the blue Liberal faction, if there is a faction, but the blue Liberal voter, the blue Liberal clientele of the Liberal Party. So to lose someone like Scott Bryson might suggest to some of those people who are more in the center of the political spectrum that the Liberals don't have that same voice around the cabinet table. So I think that is something that probably hurts them a little bit more than losing someone like Scott Bryson in Nova Scotia, because Nova Scotia is a place where the Liberals do pretty well. They have the provincial government there. So they might be able to still retain that seat because it has voted Liberal now for some time. But just that voice, that moderate voice around the cabinet table might be one that's missed. You
know, it is an interesting, I think it was a John Manley that came out and expressed some concern that the blue Liberal, the more fiscally responsible Paul Martin era Liberal, was leaving especially a position like Treasury Board. This government has said it would balance the books about this time heading into an election campaign. That's clearly not going to happen. And there has been concern about how quickly infrastructure money, for example, has been getting out, and other money that is intended to highlight priorities for the government. So yes, Scott Bryson was apparently difficult in the sense that he stood up and said, I'm not sure this is the one we want to go with right now. I think we have to sort of readjust some of our priorities from various department ministers, and that rank people. That's what the Treasury Board president is supposed to do, to ensure that there is that accountability for the spending. I'm not sure, you know, Jane Philpott, she's new to politics. She was only elected for the first time in 2015, if she has that same kind of fiscal blue streak to her, but clearly she will be tasked with making sure some of this money starts to flow so the government, when it goes to the polls, can point to people working who would not have been otherwise. All
right, let's go to Janice McGregor, who's standing in front of Rideau Hall right now. Janice, take us through who you've seen arrive at Rideau Hall so far.
Everything's gone down.
Yeah, so just to sum up, all the key ministers that my colleague there, Chris Hall, has been reporting, we have seen all of those people go in. We saw Philpott, we saw O'Regan, we saw Wilson Raybould, we saw David Linetti, who's being elevated to full cabinet position here. We were waiting for potentially one more vehicle, but some of our colleagues from other networks that are staking out a side door here at Rideau Hall have seen Nova Scotia MP Bernadette Jordan go in, and that would answer another question we had, which is who will be the new cabinet representative from Nova Scotia? That would appear to be our answer to that one, so that would make 5 in this cabinet shuffle, if that's what it is, but I don't see any more cars coming down here, saying we're getting a little bit closer to the time. The other thing I can tell you, another kind of side backdoor update here, the PM's already inside, so we aren't going to see the PM's motorcade pull up here at the front door. We're not going to get a glimpse of him until the ceremony starts inside.
All right, thank you very much, Janice. And if there's been a sighting of Bernadette Jordan, that, of course, as Janice just said, is the question about Nova Scotia. They have to put someone in there from Nova Scotia. And also, they're probably keeping in mind that they want to have, Justin Trudeau has said that having a gender-balanced cabinet is something that they want. What we know about Bernadette Jordan, she's one of the new MPs from 2015, and she'd been a parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions. And so this will, of course, solve the problem of making sure that they do have some representation from Nova Scotia, and perhaps it addresses any concerns they might have about gender parity if they're bringing David Linetti and making sure that if it goes to a cabinet of 18 and 18.
And the one other thing I want to continue to hammer away at, she is from a rural riding, which this is something that this government needs more representation. The cabinet is very tilted heavily towards urban centres, the Vancouvers, the Torontos, the Montreals, even Seamus O'Regan, for example, example, is from St. John. So I think that is one of the key factors here, with Scott Bryson also representing a rural riding. You wanted to replace him with somebody who had those sensitivities, who had a different kind of framework from which to approach national politics. Speaking of the rural concerns and making sure those sensitivities are represented in cabinet, what do you foresee for the Liberals, Eric, in terms of dealing with those kinds of challenges when, as Chris says, you know, there is a very urban tilt to cabinet?
Those are some of their most significant challenges. And it's not only an urban tilt to cabinet, it's an urban tilt to the whole Liberal caucus. More or less, they're only Liberal seats. They have a few here and there in the rest of the country, but the majority of them are in Atlantic Canada because they won them all of the seats there. So I think for them, that is a bit of a concern that there are some seats in Eastern Ontario, in the BC interior. There's some places where the Liberals do have some rural or rural-ish seats surrounding maybe one big city that they might be concerned that they will be losing. So to make sure they have that voice in cabinet is absolutely important, because you don't want to have a cabinet that's too geographically based, too demographically concentrated in one group. So to have someone in cabinet who can continue to be a rural voice is extremely important for the Liberals, because it sends a signal. Not that the election will be won or lost on Liberal rural seats, but you want to at least be able to tell people that they have voices that can represent everybody in the country. Yeah, she's an interesting case. I mean, she is, I believe she was in health fundraising. That was what she did in her private life before she was first elected in 2015. She was just made a parliamentary secretary in August, I believe, so relatively new on the scene. I have to admit, I had to look her up. I wasn't really sure who she was and what her background is, but again, I was told when doing my calls around that when her name came up is that she's worked very hard. The people have been impressed with what she's brought to the caucus. She was Atlantic Caucus chair for a short time, and that also helped sort of raise her profile within the party. So her being brought in is interesting. A lot of people were thinking it might be Sean Fraser, who's from Central Nova, because it's such a key Conservative seat in the past, but the gender balance may have factored into that as well.
And when we take a look overall, Chris, at the strategy that the government is trying to sort of execute heading into this election, when you take a look at the changes that we know so far, do you see any clear winners or losers as a result of this shuffle within cabinet?
Well, I think two things. Let me take a broader picture first. One is that you didn't, as Prime Minister, want to send a message that you had to make a wholesale change to your cabinet. Scott Bryson's departure forced your hand to a certain extent, but then clearly there was another opportunity here to address some of those weaknesses. Winners and losers, I think it's a little early to say, but I would say that for Jody Wilson-Raybould, she's been the Justice Minister, a very high-profile position, not only just because of the position itself, but because of who she is. Moving her to veterans is an interesting, I'm not sure what the signal is there, but clearly that would be, as I said, a lateral shuffle. For Seamus O'Regan, moving into Indigenous services, those will be big shoes to fill. Jane Philpott has done, by almost everybody's standard, an amazing job. There are a fair number of things still left to be done, including the child care legislation that was coming in. There's some promises to devolve authority over education to First Nations who are willing and capable of accepting it. So he will be a very busy person, and I think they want to send a signal that for a relationship that the Prime Minister has identified as being the most important to him, the one between the Crown and Indigenous people, Seamus O'Regan is going to have a big job ahead of him.
All right, you are watching a special Cabinet Shuffle edition of Power and Politics here on CBC News Network, but we have our eye on some other breaking news that's unfolding this morning. A Chinese court has sentenced a Canadian, Robert Schellenberg, to death on drug trafficking charges. Prosecutors sought the death penalty after saying a 15-year sentence that he was given in November was too lenient. The CBC's Michael Serapio joins us from the breaking news desk in Toronto with more on this. Michael, what can you tell us?
Well, I can tell you at this point, Katie, that this news has just come down the last hour. Breaking news, a Chinese court in the northeastern part of the People's Republic, as you say, sentencing Robert Schellenberg to a death sentence. 36-year-old from Abbotsford, British Columbia, sentenced to death, convicted, say prosecutors, of drug smuggling. Now, Schellenberg, we have to point out, was originally arrested in 2014, and while maintaining his innocence, saying that he did not engage in any drug activity, he was sentenced to 15 years, as you say, in a Chinese prison for that crime. But in December, November, it was announced that he would be retried as prosecutors said the sentence was too lenient. Now, that decision to have Schellenberg retried considered controversial as it happened after the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. She was detained, as you know, by Canadian officials at Vancouver International Airport as they were carrying out an extradition order at the request of the United States. Now, since Meng's arrest, the People's Republic China has been very active in pressuring Canada to have her released, even though that is outside of the extradition process. And in response, we've seen the detention of 2 Canadians, the arrest of 2 Canadians in China. We're talking about former Canadian diplomat Michael Kovrig, as well as Canadian businessman Michael Spavor. And the question has been whether or not Schellenberg's, the order to retry him for a harsher sentence, was actually sparked by the Meng case and China's continued push to have her released. Now, that question aside, he has now been sentenced to death by a Chinese court. Again, this is happening just this morning. We should note, though, that this is not over for Schellenberg, because according to the process that we've been able to look at on the Chinese website, and this is through the interpretation that we've been able to get through a translator, it looks like Schellenberg does have, starting tomorrow, 10 days to actually appeal his death sentence, but certainly more pressure on Canada in light of the Meng case, and Schellenberg right now caught in the crossfire, perhaps paying with his life. Again, though, there is an appeal process that he might be able to pursue, Katie.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. We're going to continue to follow this breaking news throughout the morning. If you're just joining us, you are watching a special edition of Power and Politics. I'm Katie Simpson here with Chris Hall and Eric Grenier. And moments from now, we will show you the cabinet shuffle about to get underway at Rideau Hall. Janice McGregor is outside on a very chilly minus 18-degree morning. Janice, recap what you've seen so far and tell us what you know.
Yeah, officials have just told us that the arrivals are done. So everybody who is involved in this cabinet shuffle, they're now inside. So we aren't going to see any more limos pull up. What's been done has been done. So that means we know kind of that there are 5 people involved in this cabinet shuffle based on the arrivals we've seen. You've been talking all morning about Jane Philpott taking over as the president of the Treasury Board into her previous role as Indigenous Services Minister. We're going to see Seamus O'Regan. He's arrived into his role. We are going to see Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was Justice Minister. Now she is taking over at Veterans Affairs. We saw her come in. None of these ministers, I should say, chose to tell us anything on the way in. We tried. My colleague Chris Rance always kind of inviting them to give us their thoughts. They all said wait till later, so we will hear from some of them hopefully after the ceremony. Into the Justice portfolio goes one of the 2 promotions we're anticipating here. David Linetti, who was previously a parliamentary secretary to a couple of very high-profile files in this cabinet, he is being elevated, we understand, and that's a big move for the Montreal area MP. And then we have another newcomer, Bernadette Jordan. We needed a minister in this cabinet from Nova Scotia with Scott Bryson's departure, and that she seems to be the answer to that question, who will represent Nova Scotia. Bernadette Jordan from the South Shore, not a Halifax, not an urban riding, from the South Shore, St. Margaret's riding. And we believe that's it, 5. So shouldn't be a terribly long ceremony when it gets underway. We understand the Prime Minister is already inside and in place. So that's what we have to look forward to.
All right, thank you very much, Janice. So in just in less than 10 minutes, this cabinet shuffle is officially going to get underway. What we've sort of learned, Janice sort of touched on it. There were a couple of questions that we didn't know going into today about who the newcomers could be, because they had a couple of holes they need to fill. 1, they need to have someone from Nova Scotia. 2, Justin Trudeau has maintained that having a gender-balanced cabinet is something that he wants, and so it appears with the addition of Bernadette Jordan and David Linetti that balance will stay. Tell me, what do we know about Bernadette Jordan? Most of our viewers might not know who she is. Chris, what do we know about her?
Not a lot. First-time candidate in 2015. She won in a riding that had been held by the Conservatives under Gerald Keddy for many, many years. She had a background in fundraising for healthcare in the area where she represents, which is South Shore St. Margaret's. She has been a relatively new addition to the parliamentary secretary fold, doing democratic institutions, which with elections and the like, it's taken on more significance over over the last 4 years, concerns about how to monitor third-party activity, how to prevent foreign interference like we've seen in other countries, including the United States. So clearly she has done a very good job, as I understand it, as Atlantic Caucus Chair, came to the attention of the powers that be around the Prime Minister's office. So she's being tasked with a new portfolio because, as we've described, the other four pretty much replace each other in a circle. There will have to be a new creation. We've talked from the very beginning that one of the things they're trying to look at is how to promote rural seats, rural issues, and maybe Atlantic Canada. There used to be a separate standalone department for that. So she'll do something, I would assume, in those areas.
Eric, and have the Liberals sort of been seen as tone deaf or having some significant challenges when it comes to rural issues?
Well, I think so. I think that in general we've seen that the Liberals have struggled with voters who tend towards the Conservative, that all else being equal, they might be voting Conservative. We've seen this in some of their in some of the town halls that the Prime Minister has done recently, going to Kamloops, going to Regina. Obviously not rural, but that some of the issues have impacted him. There was the comment he made about male construction workers going into northern Canada and disrupting communities there. And when he was asked about that in the town hall in Regina, he did not engage very much with the question. It was clearly something that he had seen, that he had made a bit of an error there. So I think there was some sensitivity about how they're seen outside of urban areas, outside of the places where they do quite well, where it's people who are maybe more the middle class, upper middle class, university educated, that those groups, they might have those in the bag that they can count on their votes, but it's people who live in rural areas and suburban areas, places that are outside of the urban centers of the country, where they are still a bit sensitive about how they're seen as a bit of an urban party, as a party that's not really in tune with the values of people who live outside of these city centres.
Chris, I was going to ask you, do you think this is maybe perhaps the Liberals trying to eat a little bit of the Conservatives' lunch if they want to make sure that they do, bringing in someone like Bernadette Jordan, who does have these ties to where she's her rural community? Do you think that that's an attempt to sort of maybe mow a little bit of that lawn?
No, I actually think this is more of a rearguard action, because Scott Bryson would have represented that kind of community as well in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia, as Eric was pointing out. A lot of their rural seats are in Atlantic Canada, so it makes some sense to have someone do that, to have special attention to Nova Scotia issues and perhaps even more broadly to Atlantic Canada. But as you point out, the Conservatives are the ones who are really strongest, outside of Quebec anyway, in rural ridings. The NDP has some rural seats as well in Quebec. So if you're looking to try and build on strength, and if you understand that the idea of being able to win all 32 seats in Atlantic Canada again is going to be a very difficult feat to replicate, this is the kind of move you would want to make to shore up that rural area, to send a signal that you understand that Scott Bryson might have represented that viewpoint before, and now you're continuing that with another minister.
We've got some new pictures where you're looking at a live look of inside Rideau Hall, where in just a few minutes, less than about 5 minutes, this ceremony is officially going to get underway. As we've mentioned, there are 5 people that we have spotted that have gone into Rideau Hall that we know are involved in the shuffle. And as we heard from Janice McGregor, our reporter who's been out front of Rideau Hall in very cold conditions, that these are the 5 that we've sort of either been reporting on, confirming what the moves are going to be, or had some informed speculation about. We've seen Jane Philpott, as CBC's David Cochrane mentioned yesterday. She will be moving from Minister of Indigenous Services, and that was a portfolio that was created in 2017, August of 2017. She'll be moving from her portfolio into the President of the Treasury Board. Her previous position with Indigenous Services is far more high profile than the Treasury Board, President of the Treasury Board. However, the President of the Treasury Board has some very significant responsibilities. And Chris, I'm just wondering if you can sort of speak to how key that role is within government, even if it isn't necessarily the most high profile position.
I think it's critical, especially heading into an election campaign, when you want to be able to show Canadians that you are spending money wisely and that the money that you are spending is having the maximum effect. So if, for example, I keep coming back to infrastructure, I know it's not technically her portfolio, but making sure that money flows for social housing, for important infrastructure projects would go through her. So not a high-profile position. You know, we didn't mention a lot about Scott Bryson, who was in that position before, but she will, I think, be seen to be the kind of person that will be able to say, we need to get moving, get people marshaled around the prospect of getting money out the door, and making sure that it's spent in a way that they can take the most credit for it down in the fall.
Okay, we do have another question. We are taking some questions from social media. Stephen Van Newkirk asks us on Facebook, any bets Sohi is shuffled out? I don't think that's happening. Eric, any thoughts on that? We have not seen him this morning.
We have not, unless he snuck in somewhere. It doesn't seem that he is in the shuffle. That would have been a big move for the Liberals had they done that, because he was moved into that portfolio in the last cabinet shuffle. It was seen as very important to have an Alberta minister handling the natural resources file. He hasn't gotten a lot of praise for his handling of that file since he's had it, but the Liberals have had a bit of a difficult file on that one with the purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Not too much of a winning scenario for Amarjeet Sohi. I don't think he was given a portfolio where he was set up to succeed. But if they had decided to move him, it would have sent a signal that they weren't happy with where things were going. But who would they have put in that position if not an Alberta minister? So I think that for Amarjeet Sohi, this has to be his file, and they know that if they're going to do if they're going to have any sort of electoral success in Alberta, it's going to have to happen in a seat like in Edmonton, where Amarjeet Sohi has his riding.
You know, I think I agree completely with Eric. I remember when they bought Trans Mountain, they sent out the 2 cabinet ministers responsible to explain the decision. Amarjeet Sohi wasn't one of them, but he showed up anyway as the Alberta representative in cabinet. And I think that to move him now would say less about him than it would be about what the Liberals thought of their opportunities in Alberta. It's a tough file, obviously. A lot of it is out of his hands because we're still waiting for court rulings on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. They're doing the new round of consultations to ensure that Indigenous groups along the route are properly consulted and properly engaged. There's an effort to try and do that the last time around that fell short. It's not good enough to simply show up and do nothing, was what the courts had said. So they're going through those discussions again, seeing what accommodations can be made to make sure this pipeline gets built. And look, this is critical. In Alberta, there's going to be an election in this spring, provincially, with Rachel Notley. She has brought in a price on carbon, and in return, she was supposed to get a pipeline that would take Alberta's bitumen to a port so it could be shipped overseas. She's fulfilled her part of the bargain, still hasn't got a pipeline. So I think that leaving him there was a real key signal with an election coming up, with Jason Kenney, the United Conservative Party leader, and Rachel Notley going to be engaging, and I think a very, very spirited campaign around the whole issue of natural resources.
Would it have sent a signal to Alberta if perhaps they did bring in maybe even a second cabinet minister from Alberta? You mentioned that heading into the last cabinet shuffle, there had been some speculation that Randy Boissonnault, who is the special advisor to the Prime Minister on LGBTQ initiatives, and from my understanding, it was thought that he had a very strong performance when it came to dealing with the apology and organizing the government and delivering the apology to members of Canada's LGBTQ community. Would there be room to try and send a signal to Alberta if they brought in a second minister from Alberta?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. They both represent Edmonton ridings, which is more likely to vote Liberal than say the outlying regions. But I'm not sure that having a second minister in itself would be enough. Randy Boissonnault, a very good communicator, flawlessly bilingual, very much front and center on, as you said, the consideration of the apology for LGBTQ, for the purge. I guess if you really were looking through the tea leaves and whether or not 2 cabinet ministers from one city and one province would make a difference, I think the answer would be probably not.
Okay, so we're taking a live look inside Rideau Hall right now, and any moment now, this cabinet shuffle is officially going to be underway. You can see sitting in the second row there, that's Jerry Butts, who is the Prime Minister's principal secretary. So senior members of the Prime Minister's office are at Rideau Hall as expected for this cabinet shuffle. We've seen or heard of at least 5 people going in, and we know everyone is in so far. Ministers Jane Philpott, Seamus O'Regan, and Jody Wilson-Raybould went in, and there are 2 newcomers to cabinet who also were either spotted by TV news crews or we saw live on TV walking in. One is David Linetti and the other is Bernadette Jordan. So things to watch for in this shuffle. We know that through our reporting over the weekend and starting as early as mid last week that Jane Philpott has been tapped to step in as the president of the Treasury Board, moving from Minister of Indigenous Services. Again, That was a new position that was created back in 2017 to try and divide the Indigenous portfolio, to try and put more attention, more focus, and put two ministers on that issue, because the Prime Minister has said that that is a key issue, rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship. That's been a priority for him as Prime Minister. We also saw Seamus O'Regan, who had been or has been the Minister of Veterans Affairs. We know through our reporting that he is being shuffled, and he will be taking over Jane Philpott's old role as Minister of Indigenous Services. O'Regan had some trouble in his portfolio with some challenges over the past, particularly few months, rubbing some veterans the wrong way. He had a very public dispute with a well-known veterans advocate named Sean Bruyere, and he also really made some veterans uncomfortable when he made some comments about comparing his transition from being life in television to life not in television. And while he very much tried to get the sentiment across, it's not the same as leaving the military. Many within the military family and military community felt that was an issue. Jody Wilson-Raybould, who's been the Minister of Justice and Attorney General since this cabinet was created, she is being moved to take on the role from what we have been reporting through our sources, through Chris Hall confirming that, we're breaking that this morning, moving into the role of Minister of Veterans Affairs, moving from one of the most senior positions within the cabinet to a cabinet position that is fraught with challenges. And Chris, let's talk again a little bit about how troublesome the issue, the file of Veterans Affairs has been, not just for this government, but for the previous Conservative government as well. It is a very difficult file.
Yeah, people have put their life on the line to serve their country in places like Afghanistan, even in the former Yugoslavia. There are a whole new cadre of veterans that really the department, I think, slowly began to realize had to take a greater priority, because so much of the past have been with Korean and Second World War veterans, different kinds of issues, different kinds of physical and emotional problems. So you're right, the Conservatives also wrestled with how to best support these people over the continuation of their lives, those who've been injured in service. And it has bedeviled this government to a certain extent, said, well, particularly these lifelong pensions, and whether this was actually the most effective and the most fair way to compensate people for the time that they served overseas. So yes, it'll be a big challenge for Jody Wilson-Raybould. It's one that Seamus O'Regan was making some progress in, but as you noted, he got into trouble with some of the things that he said. So I'm not sure what the signal is, why she's being chosen to fill that role, but clearly it will be a big challenge because there's still a lot of work to do.
Eric, can you sort of speak to the big picture challenges that come with Veterans Affairs when it comes to popularity and comes to polling? Because when an issue goes wrong in Veterans Affairs, there certainly it can go very wrong.
And it's not just about the veterans. And when we're talking about the electoral impact, because everybody wants the country to do everything that's possible for veterans, people who put their lives on the line for the country. So it not only hurts them among veterans, people who've served in the military, but people who want to make sure that the country is doing something to give back to these people who gave so much to the country. So for any government, the Conservatives were very sensitive about this, that they were not handling it in the way that they might have wanted to. They were very sensitive to attacks from veterans, because that would have been a group that should have been in their column to begin with. So I think for the Liberals, they know that this is a very sensitive file. It's a very difficult file. And if they do not deliver on it, it does not hurt them just among veterans, hurts them among all Canadians.
Remember, one of the things they did immediately was to reverse the closure of those regional offices for Veterans Affairs to make sure that people could get more adequate and more timely service from Veterans Affairs. So Eric's absolutely right. It's not just about the veterans themselves, although that's the most important consideration. There is a sense that the polls have consistently said that people want governments to do right by the people who have served in the armed forces.
So those are the three existing cabinet ministers we know about. There are two newcomers we're expecting that we've spotted or have been spotted. One is David Linetti, and one is Bernadette Jordan. But the biggest sort of departure here, of course, is Scott Bryson, and with Jane Philpott stepping in to fill his role. Chris, I'm wondering if you can sort of speak to what it is that the Treasury Board President does and how critical that role is.
Well, as I've been indicating, it is not a high public profile position, but it is the one that's responsible for three things: making sure government programs identified by the finance minister are adequately funded. Its important role is to ensure that the money is spent effectively and efficiently, and to ensure there's accountability for that. In the past, it was the Conservatives with, I think it was Tony Clement, who was Treasury Board President, began to sort of expand the mandate to be able to look at public sector bargaining, for example. That has since been rolled back, but that's about the only time you ever really hear about the Treasury Board President. For Jane Philpott, because of how effectively she dealt with the health issues, with things like the legalization of cannabis, with the opioid crisis, and then she was moved to Indigenous services because there were clearly some issues about listening to and responding effectively to the concerns about childcare, about education, about potable drinking water on reserves. She has done a very good job there, and frankly, I think we could say that she has become the Ms. Fix-It of this government. When there is a real problem, they move Jane Philpott in to fix it.
Okay, we're getting a heads up from our team on the ground that this ceremony is just about to start. You can see that Rideau Hall, there's some empty chairs right there in the front. That is where the ministers will be sitting, and let's listen in.
Please rise and welcome the ministers designate, the Prime Minister and the Governor-General of Canada. Pour débuter cette cérémonie d'assermentation des membres du 29e Conseil des ministres canadiens, veuillez vous lever et accueillir les ministres désignés, le Premier ministre et la gouverneure générale du Canada. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir. The clerk of the Privy Council will now seek the Governor-General's consent to proceed. Le greffier du Conseil privé demandera maintenant à la gouverneure générale la permission de procéder.
Excellence, pouvons-nous commencer? Excellency, may we proceed?
With the Governor-General's approval, we will now proceed to the ceremony. Maintenant que la gouverneure générale a signifié son approbation, nous procéderons à la cérémonie. The ministers who are Privy Councillors and who are changing responsibilities will please come forward to take the oath of office. Les ministres qui sont membres du Conseil privé et qui changent de responsabilité sont priés de s'avancer pour prêter le serment d'office. The Honourable Jody Raybould, Minister of Veteran Affairs and Associate Minister of National Defence. L'Honorable Jody Raybould, Ministre des Anciens Combattants et Ministre associé de la Défense nationale.
I, Jody Raybould, do solemnly and sincerely promise and declare that I will truly and faithfully, to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as a Minister of Veterans Affairs and Associate Minister of National Defence.
The Honourable Jane Philpott, President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Digital Government. L'Honorable Jane Philpott, Présidente du Conseil du Trésor et Ministre du Gouvernement numérique.
I, Jane Philpott, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear
that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Digital Government. So help me God. Moi, Jane Philpott.
I, Jane Philpott, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister responsible for Treasury Board and Minister of Digital Government. So help me God.
The Honourable Seamus Thomas Harris O'Regan, Minister of Indigenous Services. L'Honorable Seamus Thomas Harris O'Regan, Ministre des Services aux Autochtones.
I, Seamus Thomas Harris O'Regan, do solemnly and sincerely promise and declare that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Indigenous Services. Moi, Seamus Thomas Harris O'Regan,
I, Seamus Thomas Harris O'Regan, do solemnly and sincerely promise and declare that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Indigenous Services.
The ministers designate who are not members of the Privy Council will please come forward to take the oath of allegiance, the Privy Councilor's oath, and the oath of the office. Les ministres désignés qui ne font pas partie du Conseil privé sont priés de s'avancer pour prêter le serment d'allégeance, le serment des conseils privés et le serment d'office. Monsieur David Lametti, ministre de la Justice et procureur général du Canada. Mr. David Leonetti, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada.
Moi, David Lametti,
I, David Linetti, do solemnly and sincerely swear that I shall be a true and faithful servant to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council for Canada. I, David Linetti, do solemnly and sincerely promise that I will be a true and faithful servant to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth as a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council for Canada. I will in all things to be treated, debated, and resolved in Privy Council, faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and my opinion. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, or that shall be secretly treated of in Council. Generally, in all things, I shall do as a faithful and true servant ought to do for Her Majesty. So help me God.
I, David Leonetti, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors. So help me God. I, David Leonetti, do solemnly and sincerely swear that I shall be a true and faithful servant to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council for Canada. I will in all things to be treated, debated, and resolved in Privy Council faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and my opinion. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, or that shall be secretly treated of in Council. Generally, in all things, I shall do as a faithful and true servant ought to do for Her Majesty, so help me God. Moi, David Leonetti,
I, David Leonetti, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. So help me God.
I, David Leonetti, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. So help me God.
Ms. Bernadette Jordan, Minister of Rural Economic Development. Madame Bernadette Jordan, Ministre du Développement économique rural.
I, Bernadette Jordan, do declare that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors. I, Bernadette Jordan, do solemnly and sincerely declare that I shall be true and faithful servant to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council for Canada. I will in all things be treated, debated, and resolved in Privy Council faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and my opinion. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, or that shall be secretly treated of in Council. Generally, in all things I shall do as a faithful and true servant ought to do for Her Majesty. I, Bernadette Jordan, do solemnly and sincerely promise and declare that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister for Rural Economic Development.
The Governor General, the Prime Minister, and the Clerk of the Privy Council will now sign the oath book. La gouverneure générale, le Premier ministre et le greffier du Conseil privé apposeront maintenant leur signature sur le registre des serments.
You are watching live coverage of today's Cabinet Shuffle, a Cabinet Shuffle edition of Power and Politics. I'm Katie Simpson, and we're coming to you on CBC News Network, on CBC News, on the YouTube page for CBC News, on the CBC Politics Facebook page, and on Twitter. Our handle there is @PNP CBC. I'm here with Chris Hall, host of CBC Radio's The House, and CBC's polls analyst Eric Grenier. We are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister. He's going to take some questions once this is all wrapped up. You can see he's adding his signature to all of the official documents, as is part of protocol right now. And just to give you a recap, if you're just joining us, this was a 5-person cabinet shuffle. It took place to deal with the departure of Treasury Board President Scott Bryson. So Jane Philpott is now the president of the Treasury Board. Seamus O'Regan is now replacing Philpott as Minister of Indigenous Services. Jody Wilson-Raybould becomes the new Minister of Veterans Affairs and Associate Minister of National Defence. David Linetti is now taking on, I thought they were going to say something there. David Linetti is now taking on the Justice Minister portfolio, and Bernadette Jordan takes on a brand new portfolio as Minister of Rural and Economic Development. Chris and Eric, I want to ask you both the same question. What stood out to you guys? Chris, we'll start with you.
Well, I hesitate to read too much into body language, but Jodie Wilson-Raybould did not look very happy. As I said earlier, at best is probably a lateral move to go to Veterans Affairs from Justice. We were talking during the ceremony of the 3 most important cabinet portfolios: finance, global affairs, justice are probably the top 3. So I think that she's probably not the happiest. David Linetti, an interesting choice. He's a former McGill law prof, has done a very good job as the Parliamentary Secretary on Innovation, widely respected within that sector of the economy. I'd also point out from a downtown Montreal riding, doesn't seem to be underrepresented, but he is an Italian Canadian, and I don't want to overestimate that, but also don't want to underestimate it. Along with Philomena Tassi, they're the only 2 in cabinet who have that background. Obviously, the Italian community, a big presence in Montreal, might be also sending a signal there if you're looking ahead to, October of 2019.
Eric, what stood out to you?
Yeah, well, there aren't a lot of very obvious electoral moves on this. I think it has much more to do with messaging and the like. Because if they were trying to address geographic representation, Nova Scotia, it was 1-for-1. They had a rural riding that was represented by Scott Bryson. Now they have one that's represented by Bernadette Jordan in cabinet. So it still has that Nova Scotia voice, still has that rural voice. David Linetti, Montreal, as you said, already well represented. The Prime Minister, Marc Garneau, also from the island of Montreal and in cabinet as well. So not some clear, those kinds of moves, because when they made the last shuffle in last summer, there were some clear ones. They added ministers from Vancouver, from the GTA. There were some clear moves there that had some electoral implications. This one, because Bryson's departure was what prompted all of this, it wasn't a planned shuffle. I think you see why here it's more of a personnel move here to try to make sure that the right people are in the right files to set them up for the next election.
We also talk a lot about gender equity in the cabinet. I just did a little research. In both cases, Jody Wilson-Raybould becomes the 3rd woman to be Veterans Affairs Minister after Kim Campbell and Albina Guarnieri, who held that position during Paul Martin's 2-year minority government. And the same is true at Treasury Board. Pat Carney, a former Conservative under Brian Mulroney, was Treasury Board President, and Lucien Robillard, again, under Paul Martin's government. So I don't know what you want to read into those things, but for a Prime Minister who talks a great deal about the importance of gender equity, that may be a signal as well that they're trying to send, that these women are in positions that are not necessarily ones that are generally occupied by women.
And I want to talk about the new woman to join cabinet, Bernadette Jordan. We've got sort of it's a new portfolio that she's going to be dealing with, Minister of Rural Economic Development, and we have a little sort of outline of what her priorities are. We, of course, are going to be waiting for the mandate letters to be updated and put out. That usually takes a few weeks at best. But what the government is saying right now about her priorities will be is to oversee the creation of a rural development strategy to spur economic growth and create middle-class jobs in rural Canada. Okay, that would what you would expect. But she'll also take action to bring high-speed internet to more rural households and businesses, and work with municipalities, provinces, territories, and Indigenous partners to meet the needs of infrastructure in rural communities. Chris and Eric, what does that say to you about with that being her focus?
Two quick things. I don't know if this is going going to be a standalone department or one like we found with Bill Blair when he took over as the cross-border czar and on the drug strategy or gun control. You know, it's difficult to create a new department. How quickly can she get up to speed when there's only 9 months to a next election campaign? But clearly, as we talked somewhat extensively on this program, the Liberals are concerned about rural seats and broadband internet access. These kinds of issues have been ongoing since the previous government. So I think they want to signal to those rural voters that we take your issues seriously. There'll be someone here inside the cabinet with the ear of the Prime Minister who's trying to address those things. Whether that works or not, if there's not a standalone department, whether she has enough time to make a real difference, we'll have to wait and see.
And Erica, I'm going to ask you that in just a second, but we're going to go to Janice McGregor, who is actually at Rideau Hall right now. Janice, we're just wondering if you can give us a sense of what stood out for you during this ceremony.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're sworn in order of precedence, right, and the length of time they've been in cabinet. But kind of an interesting thing here, I was sort of reviewing some of the notes that the government gave us regarding this cabinet shuffle, and we've had a little bit of history made today. Apparently, Bernadette Jordan is the first female minister to ever represent Nova Scotia in a federal cabinet in Canadian history, which I did not know, that there had never been a female minister from Nova Scotia. So you were talking about the gender issues earlier, and of course we've been talking since Trudeau was sworn in about his preference for putting, you know, his status as a feminist prime minister front and center, having a gender-balanced cabinet. This would be another thing, I guess, another first for his government, having a female minister from Nova Scotia. So there's a little political trivia for you as Bernadette Jordan joins the cabinet in a new portfolio. Of course, we'll have to see how this ministry is staffed up and exactly what she's tasked with and where the resources are for all of those different things. She'll need to be working, I think, with Minister Philpott, the Treasury Board President. I guess we should call her President Philpott now, who is in charge of digital government. If this rural ministry that they've created for her now is going to be making some moves on broadband and things like that. So I guess we'll see how that works, but yeah, it's sort of a little bit of a first there. But we're just standing by. I have to keep looking over my shoulder. The podium where Prime Minister Trudeau will come out to speak to us is just behind me here. We're told he'll come out and take a few questions, and then we're expecting to hear from all the new ministers. So hopefully they'll be able to articulate why they're excited about their new roles, what they're looking forward to, and probably have a hard question or two maybe from our colleagues about what lies in store in each of their departments. I was going to say, Janice, the Prime Minister, and of course we'll carry it live when he comes on out. It should be any moment now because the ceremony, of course, is just wrapping up. But Janice, what are sort of the pressing concerns or what are the unknowns at this point about the changes that we've seen? What's sort of the big question that stands out to you? In terms of today's cabinet shuffle? Yeah, in terms of, what... I mean, I think it's interesting to think of it in terms of, you know, put yourself forward to October. We're on the campaign trail and the kind of things this government could be criticized for. You know, the veterans portfolio is one that could be radioactive in certain constituencies and with certain groups. I think there have been some criticisms about the way things have gone down on that. Our colleague Murray Brewster has done some excellent reporting on some really kind of unpleasant, I don't know what to call them, accounting issues at that department, for example. Having a new minister in that portfolio obviously kind of changes the face of that and maybe tries to turn a page a little bit. You know, Indigenous services, again, you know, in certain parts of the country that is going to be a very, very important thing that they want to look like they've been successful on. So they'll be looking for continuity, I think, with Minister O'Regan taking over that portfolio. So, you know, each new minister brings a new style to things as well. So it'll be interesting to see, for example, the tone that Wilson Raybould sets in Veterans Affairs versus the people who have gone before her, that sort of thing. And of course, you know, the two newcomers, now full cabinet ministers, you know, how will they respond? How will they perform? So.
All right, thank you very much, Janice. And of course, we'll go live back to Rideau Hall as soon as the Prime Minister comes on out. And there are definitely some difficult questions for him ahead of why and what this bigger picture strategy means. Eric, I want to ask you, we were talking just a moment ago about the new portfolio that Bernadette Jordan is going to be dealing with. And the two things that really stand out so far is getting rural communities broadband internet and improving infrastructure in rural communities. What does that say to you about where this government might see some of its challenges or places where they might be able to score some political points?
Well, I think if they're thinking of rural ridings, there's the ones that they want to keep that are ones in Atlantic Canada. But in Quebec, there's a lot of ridings that they think that they have some chances to pick up from the New Democrats, from the Bloc Québécois. And a lot of them are in some more rural areas. And during the recent provincial election campaign in Quebec, getting more access to high-speed internet and broadband was one of the issues of that campaign. So clearly that is an issue that could have some impact in Quebec, where they do want to make some gains. But I think, as Chris had said earlier, it is a bit more of a defensive measure, because they know that they're in trouble in rural Canada, where they don't have many seats, but they want to hold everything that they can, and also pass along the message that they are listening to all these different concerns from groups that they do not have a lot of representation in their caucus from. So I think it is a bit of a two-pronged approach in that sense. But clearly in rural Canada, there's not a lot of prospects for them, particularly outside of Quebec. Having that voice, and very specifically to deal with rural issues, might help them in that sense. Scott Bryson was from a rural riding, but this was not his portfolio. This was not his focus. This will be for Bernadette Jordan.
But I want to repeat this. I think it bears repeating, and that is, what is the mandate that she will be given? How much access to a department will she have? Is this a standalone department, or going to be reporting up through, let's say, the Minister of Innovation, Navdeep Bains? We know that Bill Blair had, when he became the border czar, if I can call him that, there was a lot of work to do because he was folded inside the envelope of public safety, didn't have his own staff, and it wasn't clear, because his mandate letter took 3 or 4 weeks to come out, what it was that he was supposed to do. So given the time frame of an election campaign later this year, and if you recognize what Eric said, that this is an area where the Liberals might be vulnerable, you want her up and running quickly with things to announce to show that it's more than just we created a department and had a minister titled about rural economic development and can actually show some results.
I want to go back to what is really the surprise of the morning, and that is Jody Wilson-Raybould. We were just saying we don't want to read too much into the body language, but I think you have to at this point, because this is a high-profile position. The minister, being Minister of Veterans Affairs, is obviously a very important ministry, and that is not something that I'm just trying to say that it is not. But Chris, what's your take on the move? As you were saying, at best, you would say that's a lateral move. Yeah. What did you take from her body language? What did you take from that?
Well, she didn't look very happy, I have to say, and that's just my read of it compared to the other 4 who were taking their oaths. Look, she's a very high-profile member of this cabinet, a very high-profile candidate when she ran for the Liberals back in 2015. There have been concerns about the pace of change at the with the Justice Department. She did the significant things that were done around cannabis and around physician-assisted death were done in concert with Jane Philpott, as opposed to doing on her own. She has not always been the most effective communicator. These are just things that you hear about. I'm certain the Prime Minister will be asked when he takes questions, why was she moved? What was it about her performance that you felt needed to be changed? Or perhaps he'll say Veterans Affairs was more important. But either way, she's moving at a time when you would not expect that to happen. And given that she's from British Columbia, given her Indigenous background, to move her out of justice, I think, is probably not a good sign.
Eric, what's your take? Same sort of question. What really do you think there's more to read into this? That there's challenges perhaps with Jody Wilson-Raybould?
Well, because this was an unexpected shuffle, when they did their last shuffle, they had the last opportunity to change cabinet, what they thought was going to be their last opportunity. She stayed put. So the government decided last summer that she was good in the Minister of Justice portfolio. Now they don't. They had this opportunity. There's something that must have spurred them to think that she should be moved out of there. It's possible, as Chris says, that they wanted to move someone into Veterans Affairs rather than out of Justice, but it is one of those key portfolios. If we were talking about moving Bill Morneau or Chrystia Freeland, we would be probably having a bit of a different discussion about what this would signal in terms of the government. So it is a big move.
Yeah, this is a government that we've talked about deliverology in the past, right?
Yes.
That wants results, wants to show that it's delivering results. And there's a picture of her standing. Like I said, she's of all the ones, she was the least kind of
David Leonetti gave the Prime Minister a big hug. Yeah.
So, you know, is there a sense that she hasn't delivered to the same extent as others? Is there a sense that Veterans Affairs needs, because Seamus is only in there since August 2017, that they need to bolster there? My sense is that this was not a move they would have made otherwise, but given the opportunity of Bryson's departure, they chose to do so. And certainly the Prime Minister, I hope he'll be asked that, because it is the most interesting aspect of it.
David Leonetti, he's walking into one of the most senior roles within Cabinet. What are the big challenges that he's going to be facing, Chris?
Well, you mentioned one of them earlier. It's what's to do about Meng Wanzhou, excuse me, the Huawei executive who has been detained in Vancouver at the request of the Americans who want to extradite her for violating sanctions and on a bank fraud charge. He will ultimately, Justin Trudeau ultimately has to sign off on the decision to send anyone, so that will be a big challenge. There are still reviews being done of the criminal code. There's gun legislation, although technically C-71 falls under Ralph Goodale, but they'll need someone to strongly sort of explain the rationale for it from a Justice Department view, because you're changing the law. It's a high-profile position, and you know he's from Montreal. He's bilingual, trilingual. I think he speaks Italian as well. It's a really important job, and clearly, as I said earlier, he was widely regarded both inside and outside of the government for the work that was being done with Navdeep Bains to try to promote the innovation sector, artificial intelligence, these new technologies that are seen as being absolutely critical to the success of the Canadian economy in the future. So this is a reward, clearly.
Okay, we've got a live shot of outside Rideau Hall, and any moment now the Prime Minister is going to walk out those doors and take reporter questions, and there are quite a few given some of today's surprise moves. Janice McGregor is outside Rideau Hall, where the Prime Minister will speak with reporters shortly. But Janice, the Prime Minister has another event at 10 o'clock Eastern this morning. What's he doing after this shuffle?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, actually, pretty cool. If there's any space geeks out there, you're going to want to learn about this. Of course, we know our current Governor General is a former astronaut, Julie Payette, and Canada has someone in space right now. David Saint-Jacques is up on the space station right now, and there is an event planned in the ballroom, which is a bigger room inside Rideau Hall. If you watch a lot of cabinet shuffles, you may have noticed they were in a smaller room today to swear in these 5 new ministers. In the big ballroom, they are all set up for a kind of hookup with the space station live. There are, I'm told, about 20, a couple dozen grade 7 and 8 students who have prepared questions for David Saint-Jacques in the space station, and he's going to be having a live conversation with these students, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Governor General Julie Payette. So we are running a little bit late as far as the Prime Minister's questions are concerned, but I'm told this event with the space station won't wait. As you can imagine, there are kind of like pretty firm hookup times when you're calling the space station. So I wouldn't expect it would be too much longer before Prime Minister Trudeau comes out. Either that, or they'll have to limit the number of questions that the likes of us get. But anyway, a very kind of cool event, a big thrill, no doubt, for the students who are also here at Rideau Hall today for reasons that have nothing at all to do with the cabinet shuffle.
All right, thank you very much, Janice, and we'll be checking in with you again shortly. But we're going to keep our eye on the front doors there at Rideau Hall in case we get a heads up as to when the Prime Minister will be coming out, and of course we'll be taking those questions live. We were just talking a moment ago, and Eric, I want to start with you. From the perspective, you're our polls analyst. From your perspective, does anything that you've seen today really shift or change any momentum that this party might be trying to create?
No, I wouldn't think so. I think it is more of a micro-targeting sort of thing. And it is interesting to think of some of these moves. If you're talking about Jane Philpott, who's moving to a file that is more economic-related and money-related from Indigenous. She represents the riding of Markham-Stouffville in the GTA. That is a key riding, a key swing riding that often goes between the Liberals and the Conservatives. So maybe being on that sort of file where she's dealing with economic issues might be, or fiscal issues for the government, might be a little bit better for the government in the GTA than with Indigenous services. Whereas you have Seamus O'Regan, who's going to Indigenous. That is actually electorally also an important clientele for them. The Liberals did do very well among Indigenous Canadians in the last election. Turnout was much higher among Indigenous peoples in the country. And when you think of some of their target seats, they're looking to gain northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, northern Quebec. Those are all ridings with significant Indigenous populations that are represented right now by the NDP. The Liberals would like to pick up those seats, and maybe they think that Seamus O'Regan will be a good voice on that side of the coin.
You know, it's interesting, just to mention very quickly about Markham Stouffville. That was a riding that Paul Calandra held. Federally, she defeated him in the last election campaign, and then Paul Calandra was just recently re-elected as a Conservative MPP in Doug Ford's government. I don't want to, you know, who knows what the overlaps will be, but to Eric's point, although the Treasury Board isn't the one that mostly makes headlines, it certainly would have more relevance to the voters of Markham Stouffville, which would be a very competitive riding no matter who was holding it.
You mentioned Seamus O'Regan, and by the way, we just got a heads up that the Prime Minister will be coming up soon, so if I interrupt anybody, that is why.
You interrupting people?
I would never do that, never. My question to you, Chris, is Seamus O'Regan has not been a cabinet minister for very long. He's one of the newest members of cabinet, moving, and he didn't have a flawless performance at Veterans. Do you think that this is going to be a real significant challenge for him going into, oh, the door is opening, is that the Prime Minister?
It is.
And let's take this live.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at Rideau Hall. We just finished making changes to our cabinet. Before I get into these changes, I want to say a very sincere thank you to my friend and colleague Scott Bryson, who's leaving government to spend more time with his family. Scott has been a pillar of our party and our government for many years now, serving most recently as President of the Treasury Board and Minister of Digital Government. He will be missed, and we thank him for his service. Aujourd'hui,
today, we are continuing to work for the middle class. We are expanding our efforts to ensure that the strength of our economy will mean that every Canadian and his or her family has a real and equal chance to succeed. Since the beginning of our mandate, Canadians have created more than 800,000 jobs right across this country. The unemployment rate is at its lowest level in 40 years. And as a government, it is our intention to support progress for Canadians and to continue in this way.
Philpott, who has delivered tremendous results for Indigenous peoples across the country, will be replacing Scott as Treasury Board President and Minister of Digital Government. Jane is a natural choice for this role, having previously served as the Vice Chair of the Treasury Board. Seamus O'Regan is our new Minister of Indigenous Services. Seamus's compassion and advocacy will help us as we walk the road of reconciliation with our Indigenous partners. A leader in our cabinet, I know he will work tirelessly alongside Minister Bennett to bring about real change for Indigenous communities in this country. Jody Wilson-Raybould becomes our new Minister of Veterans Affairs. From modernizing how we appoint judges to bringing in legislation around medical assistance in dying, Jody has demonstrated tremendous skill in navigating very complex files. As a government, we owe a sacred duty to the Canadians in uniform who have long served our country with heroism and valor. With her experience and tremendous leadership, Jody will ensure our veterans receive the care and support of a grateful nation. David Leonetti
becomes the new Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. David is a critical member of our team and has been from the outset. As Parliamentary Secretary, he was responsible for internal trade as well as science and economic development. He had an impressive legal and university career serving Canadians, and he is known not only for his legal analysis, but also for his mentoring of young leaders across the country.
We welcome Bernadette Jordan to the Cabinet table as our Minister of Rural Economic Development. Since 2015, Bernadette has been a strong voice for South Shore St. Margaret's. More recently, she served as a trusted Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Democratic Institutions. She will be a great addition to our team. Now, the Minister of Rural Economic Development is a new cabinet position, and it'll play a major role in the lives of rural Canadians and their families. When our team travels across the country, visiting communities big and small, we hear all the time that the challenges facing rural, and urban Canadians are very, very different. Access to reliable high-speed internet, driving distance to the closest childcare centre, pulling together funding for infrastructure projects. These things might not be top of mind if you live in a city of 1 million people, but they can be a daily struggle in a town of 500. Les petites villes qui n'ont tout simplement pas les mêmes défis que les grandes villes.
Are not facing the same challenges as large cities. So we have to take a different approach if we want to yield results. And that is why we have created this portfolio. In this way, Canadians who live in rural areas will benefit from the support that they deserve. It's always important for our government, as we say goodbye to a familiar face, to welcome new recruits and try to continue our efforts to help the middle class and their families. Once again, thank you for being here this morning. I will now be very pleased to take your questions. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau.
Jodie Wilson-Raybould perd la justice. Est-ce que c'est parce qu'elle ne faisait pas bien le travail?
Is losing the Justice Department. Is it because she wasn't doing a good job? Why are you changing her position only 9 months from the end of the mandate? Well, the work done by Jody on major issues was exceptional, and we really need someone now who's very strong and can deliver for our veterans. Our veterans deserve someone who can continue the excellent work that's being done for them and can continue that very delicate work in terms of defending our veterans. And I am fully confident that she will do an exceptional job as Minister of Veteran Affairs. Now, a Canadian has just been condemned to death in China. Do you intend to intervene to help this Canadian? And what does this say about our relationship with China? Well, that government has changed, our government has not changed its approach when it comes to defending Canadians. We will always be there to defend the interests of all Canadians who find themselves condemned to death. And I must say this is very much a concern to see that China is acting arbitrarily and applying the death penalty to a Canadian. This is something of great concern to us, and we will continue to talk to our allies and to China about this.
As a government, we actually strengthened the policy that requires the Canadian government to always intercede on behalf of a Canadian facing the death penalty anywhere in the world. We will continue to do that as we have in this case. But I will say it is of extreme concern to us as a government, as it should be to all our international friends and allies, that China has chosen to begin to arbitrarily apply death penalty in cases facing, as in this case, facing a Canadian.
Hi, Prime Minister. Chris Ryan, CBC. Happy New Year. Jodie Wilson-Raybould, what did she not accomplish in her mandate letters to see her moved over and down into Veterans Affairs, please?
I would caution anyone who thinks that serving our veterans and making sure they get the care to which they are so justly entitled from any Canadian government is anything other than a deep and awesome responsibility. The challenges of continuing to move forward on making sure that our veterans and their families are properly supported, and our capacity to continue to close the seam in terms of working between Department of National Defence and Department of Veterans Affairs will require a deft and steady hand in the Ministry of Veterans Affairs. And Jodie Wilson-Raybould has demonstrated through her ability to navigate through difficult files, whether it's on medical assistance in dying or reform of our criminal justice system, that she is extraordinarily capable of delivering on this file that is one of the core delivery mandates that the federal government has.
And Ms. Jordan, sir, she is Atlantic Caucus Chair, moving to a portfolio where she will move around a lot. Will she be able to help you buttress, Fortress Atlantic Canada. You hold all the seats. Surely some of them may fall in the next election. Is she your stopgap to keep as many as you can?
Bernadette Jordan is an extraordinary leader who's been able to step up time and time again in defense of her community, in defense of the interests of Atlantic Canadians. She's been a very strong parliamentary secretary, and she has consistently delivered on everything we've asked of her. She was chosen by her fellow Atlantic MPs to be Atlantic Chair, Atlantic Caucus Chair, and I know that she is going to be an extraordinary voice for rural Canadians, not just in Atlantic Canada, but right across the country in a way that we know matters deeply to Canadians.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Michel Lamarche, TVA.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to hear you speak about the major promotion given to David Lametti, who becomes Minister of Justice. What does this mean for Quebec only a few months away from the next election? We recognize the extent to which David Lametti has a well-demonstrated expertise as seen through his academic and legal career. He has always been very, very much of a presence in his riding in Quebec, and we are very, very pleased to be able to allow him to continue this important task. This is an example of the depth of expertise and knowledge that one can find in our team. In 2015, we found some excellent people to form our cabinet, and following the departure of a friend who left cabinet, Scott Bryson, who did an exceptional job, we needed to make some changes, and David, through his work and through his expertise, will bring a great deal of strength to our cabinet as Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Now, with respect to Ms. Kunun, who has arrived in Canada now, are you not afraid that people might take advantage of this? She has come as a refugee, and some people might not think she should have jumped the queue. Well, we were asked by the United Nations and made a specific request in the case of Ms. Kunun to accept her as a refugee. We know that this is somewhat of an exceptional case, but Canada will always be there to help people who are in difficult circumstances. Now, with respect to his arrival here in Canada, we're very pleased that she arrived here safely, and we are now in the process of providing support and ensuring that she is taken care of. Now, in terms of your relationship with the Indigenous communities, you have been criticized often, and particularly recently, you're accused of not taking this relationship seriously. Now, what kind of message does it send when you change the minister in charge of Indigenous services and to put Mr. O'Regan in that profile right now, just before an election? Well, first of all, we did need to proceed with a cabinet shuffle because one of our ministers decided to leave cabinet to spend more time with his family. So that involved a certain number of changes. And first of all, I know that Jane Philpott will be an extraordinary minister in terms of her ability to deliver on her mandate as President of Treasury Board. At the same time, we had to find a very good candidate to fulfill the role left vacant by Jane. And Seamus definitely has the ability to deliver for veterans through his compassion, through his connection to the Indigenous communities, and he certainly has some experience as a young person going to Labrador, and I think that he will be able to demonstrate that this is a critical relationship for this government. It's important to remember that the two places where the federal government has the responsibility to provide provide services is in the area of services to veterans and services to Indigenous communities. That is a priority for me, and I'm very pleased to have very, very strong and capable ministers in those portfolios. And with respect to Jody Wilson-Raybould, I understand that you're presenting this as a lateral movement, but the fact remains that we've been hearing for months from people who are members of your government that she has underperformed. There are a lot of Liberals in your own government who are disappointed by her. How can we not see this as a downgrade? Well, we're very, very proud of the work done by Jody Wilson-Raybould on very significant and delicate issues over the years we've been in government. And we also know that we need someone who's very strong, who can continue the work with veterans, and I think Jody will do an exceptional job in that area.
We know that any time we lose a strong performer in cabinet with Scott Bryson's decision to step away, we have to make sure that we fill that role with great people. And obviously, Jane Philpott is a natural choice with her capacity to have delivered on Indigenous services so well over the past years, means that she will deeply understand the delivery that is core to fulfilling the role of President of the Treasury Board. And therefore, we needed someone strong to fill the seats on delivering of services, the seat on delivering of services to Indigenous peoples. We know that there are two areas in which the federal government has direct delivery responsibility. That's for our veterans, and that's for Indigenous peoples, and that is where we are putting tremendous emphasis as a government. Seamus's strength in delivering significant improvements to veterans over the past years has demonstrated his capacity to get things done for Canadians, and his strength and compassion, his experience and interactions with Indigenous peoples as well throughout his life will help him in terms of making sure that this government is living up to its responsibility to fix the most important relationship we have with this government, that with Indigenous peoples.
Hello, Prime Minister. Christy Kirkup from the Canadian Press. Just circling back to China, I'm wondering if the move around the death sentence for the drug smuggling case, would you classify this move as an escalation in the diplomatic tensions between Canada and China?
We are extremely concerned, as should be all countries around the world, that China is choosing to act arbitrarily, whether it is an application of its own justice system to its own citizens and people around the world, or whether it's in its choice to not respect long-standing practices and principles in regards to diplomatic immunity. This is something that everyone should be alert to, and certainly something we as a government take very seriously and will continue to engage strongly with China on.
Just on another topic, Seamus O'Regan moving into Indigenous services, I'm wondering if there was any reason to give pause to that decision based, with all due respect to the Minister, he is a non-Indigenous white man taking over this portfolio. So was there any reason to consider that factor as you were putting him in the role?
Jane Philpott has done an extraordinary job as Minister of Indigenous Services. Indigenous Services and Veterans Affairs are two of the areas in which direct delivery by the federal government needs to be done right and is an important responsibility. And I know from the tremendously positive experience and abilities that Minister O'Regan demonstrated at Veterans Affairs that he is going to continue to fulfill this fundamental responsibility for this government of delivering on reconciliation, on real services, on the kind of support that Indigenous peoples right across this country deserve. Reconciliation is not just about a government and Indigenous peoples. It's also very much around non-Indigenous Canadians doing their part as well, and that's something that we recognize.
Hi, Prime Minister. Janice Dixon, The Globe and Mail. Minister Freeland welcomed Ray Huff, the young Saudi refugee, this weekend. Is your government going to consider welcoming more women fleeing violence from that country?
Canada is always ready to stand up for human rights, always there to defend women's rights around the world. We are a country that continues to provide asylum to people who are fleeing violence, persecution, war, and oppression. We will continue to look for opportunities to demonstrate that we will consistently defend the most vulnerable in the world.
Last question.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Joyce Napier, CTV. We're 10 months away from an election campaign. How much did that play in your sort of moving around your major players?
I think one of the things is recognizing that this entire shift happens because we are losing a very strong and valued player who is choosing to spend more time with his family, and we wish Scott all the very best in his decision and in his next steps. But this really is an illustration of the depth of bench strength that Canadians sent to this government in 2015, and we're very excited about being able to show how we step up as a team. And this opportunity to put strong performers in important files and continue to demonstrate our capacity to deliver on a broad range of priorities for Canadians with great people in place is part of the exciting thing about what I get to do as Prime Minister and working with this amazing team.
We know that when an exceptional minister like Scott leaves the team, other members of the team or of cabinet have to be there to take on new responsibilities. And that is an indication of the extent to which we have an exceptional team put in place in 2015. And for me, it's also a reflection of the opportunity to work with truly exceptional individuals within caucus and within cabinet.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
And that's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau taking a series of reporter questions after finally revealing the new cabinet that will lead his government into the next election campaign. While there is a lot to unpack about what choices he and his team have made and what he said right there, there's another issue that he did break news on that is very important that we need to bring to our viewers' attention. And that is about a Chinese court has sentenced Canadian Robert Schellenberg to death on drug trafficking charges. Prosecutors had sought the death penalty after saying a 15-year sentence that he was originally given back in November, that was too lenient. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say just moments ago about that decision.
As a government, we actually strengthened the policy that requires the Canadian government to always intercede on behalf of a Canadian facing the death penalty anywhere in the world. We will continue to do that as we have in this case. But I will say it is of extreme concern to us as a government, as it should be to all our international friends and allies, that China has chosen to begin to arbitrarily apply death penalty in cases facing, as in this case, facing a Canadian.
There are three key things he said there that everyone should be aware of. One, using the word arbitrarily, which is how Canada has described the recent arrests of a former Canadian diplomat, Michael Kovrig, and a Canadian entrepreneur, Michael Spavor. Both have been detained in China in what many observers say is sort of a tit-for-tat retaliation after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, back in December at the request of the Americans on an extradition order. Canada has called the arrests of those two men arbitrary. The government has been careful to tiptoe around. They are not directly linking it as retaliation, but any observer who knows China and knows how China operates says, yes, in fact, this is a clear case of retaliation. This gentleman, Mr. Schellenberg, this Canadian who was arrested and now sentenced to death, he had been sentenced previously to 15 years in prison. And what's interesting to note is that very quickly quickly after this incident had happened with Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, suddenly there seemed to be an urgent sense that the Chinese justice system needed to reassess his situation. And so there is big concern here that the Prime Minister wouldn't describe it as an escalation. He was asked that question, but it certainly is a huge new concern here. The other two things I want to point out, not only did he describe it as arbitrary, as he is with the arrest of the other two Canadians, he also said our partners, our allies should be concerned about this. Canada has really been trying to galvanize the international community to say, hey, if China is doing this to us, just think what they can do to you. So that is another sort of pressure tactic that Canada has been employing throughout this entire situation. He also said that Canada does intercede on any case when any Canadian anywhere in the world is facing the death penalty. So this is certainly a change, certainly a worsening of tensions there. So that is something that we are going to be following very closely here on CBC News Network, as well as on Power and Politics and throughout the day. But let's get back to the news at hand. I want to bring back Chris and Eric. What stood out to you from what the Prime Minister had to say? Chris, I'll start with you and then Eric.
Well, let's start with Jody Wilson-Raybould, because that was, I think, the most surprising move, moving from Justice to Veterans Affairs. The question was, had she not fulfilled parts of her mandate letter that necessitated this kind of move? And it was, though he was ready for the question. He certainly said, look, don't anybody underestimate the importance of doing right by our veterans, and that this was not a lateral move. He answered later in French, but clearly that is one that took some people by surprise. We've talked about heading into a pre-election period of the importance of having the best communicators in positions where you are dealing with issues that are likely to be campaign-style issues. Veterans would be one of them. It's clearly a concern to Canadians, according to the polls. Don't want to steal all Eric's thunder here. But justice is also critically important, not only just for making sure that the laws that are drafted and the bills that are put forward, but also dealing with some of those very complicated issues around physician-assisted death, for example, dealing with the immense judicial backlogs. There are so many vacancies over the last few years. They did cut that back, those vacancies down, but she was criticized for taking as long as she did to get those positions filled.
Eric, what stood out to you?
Well, two things on Jody Wilson-Raybould. You could see when he was describing why each of the ministers were moving around, it was very obvious that he was selling the fact that this was not a demotion, calling her exceptional and her leadership is why she's moving here. Clearly trying to get out ahead of the idea that this would be a demotion. He had to do the same thing when he moved Mélanie Joly in the last shuffle from Canadian heritage to tourism. And also just with Seamus O'Regan, when he talked about why he was moving into Indigenous, he mentioned his compassion and advocacy, which you can see with the way that he handled the veterans file. Those were the kinds of things that were on display. But it's an interesting move to put someone like that there, because that was generally seen as Carolyn Bennett's role with that split ministry, whereas Philpott was the one who was doing more of the active, making the active decision, doing the actual hard work when it came to that file. So it seems that the government is either this is why they put him in, or that this is why they had to justify why he was moving here, but that they understand that it is about having that compassionate voice, especially over the last few weeks where there has been issues on this file, that they want to have someone who comes with maybe a bit more heart than head.
Another change, a significant change, is David Linetti, a first-time person jumping into cabinet, taking on the very senior role of Minister of Justice and Attorney General. It is the Attorney General, we were just speaking about China a moment ago, it is the Attorney General who will be making the decision as to whether Canada will extradite Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, which, of course, China is absolutely furious about. The United States, through a treaty, made a request of Canada to arrest, and they have to present their information to Canadian authorities, and a decision will have to be made as to whether Canada will extradite her. And that, at the end of the day, is the decision that has to be made by the Attorney General. Is that talk about pressure for a first-time cabinet minister? Can you sort of speak to that, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it will be a difficult choice, and it's not just because you have to weigh the letter of the law, but there is so much politics around this. Donald Trump, for example, saying he might intervene intervene and pardon Meng Wanzhou if it might help secure a trade deal between U.S. and China. A lot of people, commentators in this country, have worried that Canada's caught between this tug of war between two superpowers. Some people have suggested that we really didn't need to arrest her because the bank fraud charges related to sanctions against Iran, which we no longer apply ourselves. It will be a complicated legal and political maneuver to try and pull this off. But, you know, look, he's a long-time Montreal law professor at McGill University, specialty in intellectual property law, but most people that I know who have met with him are really struck by how well he takes a brief, how quick he is on his feet, and his understanding of the issues that are faced. So if you're going to put a newcomer into such a senior role, he would seem to be the right person for it.
Eric, as this issue continues to get worse between Canada and China, does Canada's role sort of on the world stage and how Canada handles these diplomatic disputes, from your perspective as a polls analyst, is that something that can tumble into either a spike or a drop in the polls?
Not often do foreign affairs make their way into an election campaign. They're rarely one of those decisive issues, but it is actually one of the files in which the government does pretty well. Chrystia Freeland has gotten high marks for her handling of negotiations with the United States. Justin Trudeau generally gets better marks in terms of representing Canada internationally. So Canadians are aware of that.
With the exception of perhaps the India trip, but continue.
Exactly. Well, I can say that his marks were better before this happened. They've actually gone down over the last year, though it is still one of the issues where they poll a bit better than some of the other issues. So I think they're very aware that Canadians are sensitive about how we're seen overseas. It's certainly something that we've seen very often, that whenever another country is talking about us, we are very interested to know what they think of us. So the Canadians are sensitive to that. And while there has been some government polling that has shown that Canadians are open to the idea of more trading relations with China, there's still a lot of concern about getting too close, about allowing too much Chinese influence in our economy. So Canadians are sensitive to this. They understand the idea of more trade with China, but more China in Canada, Canadians are a little bit more uncomfortable about that. So this is certainly one that's sensitive for the government, not only electorally, but also economically.
Interestingly enough, the big part that we haven't talked about is, or we've talked about before, but is the rural development part of the rural economy. If you look at issues around which this government will be judged, one of them will be, are people in rural communities getting the same standard of service as they do in urban centers? The Prime Minister spoke to that. He talked about the different reality of living in a town of 500 people, of getting health care, child care, even just broadband internet access. I think that will be a more important issue in the long run when people come down to marking their ballots. Is Canada better off, as he promised they would be? The other issues around foreign affairs, defending Canadians who've been detained overseas, clearly a role of any government, but the temperature right now on that is really high, and it could actually, I would assume, have some impact in the long term about how this government is perceived by voters.
And Eric, we've got just 1 minute left. My last question to you is, here comes Jody Wilson-Raybould, the new Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm pleased to be here on this beautiful sunny day, and I'm honored to have been named Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Your move today as a demotion, are you disappointed with today's change?
No, and I would say that I can think of no world in which I would consider working for our veterans in Canada as a demotion.
We heard rumblings in the past few months that you might be shuffled because of a performance issue. If you had to do it again, is there anything that you would do differently?
Well, I can't imagine where you've been hearing that. But in terms of the 3+ years that I spent as the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, I am incredibly proud of the work that I did, supported by an amazing minister's staff and by dedicated and hardened public servants. We accomplished essentially my mandate letter plus. I was very proud to introduce 13 pieces of legislation ranging from complex issues of medical assistance in dying, to cannabis, to impaired driving, to incredibly broad and bold reforms to the criminal justice system and family law, the latter two currently in the Senate, and I am very much looking forward to seeing the new minister shepherd these through to become law. In addition to the legislative agenda, which was entirely robust, as I said, we have accomplished amazing things in renovating and renewing an open and transparent judicial appointments process. I had the pleasure to appoint 250 judges to the Superior Courts, extraordinarily meritorious and diverse judges, and had the pleasure to appoint more judges than any justice minister in the past 2 decades, and create 75 new judicial positions. The work that we've done beyond the legislative work has been very rewarding. I am confident in terms of releasing a directive on Indigenous litigation as the previous minister, releasing principles about how, as the Attorney General, I engage in charter litigation, has opened up the role of the Attorney General and provided a window into how Attorneys General make decisions, in particular around charter, and in particular around Indigenous litigation. So to close, I'm incredibly proud of the work that I've been able to do. We've been very successful in advancing justice in this country, and I look forward to bringing the hard work, the only kind of work that I know how to do, and my strong commitment to serving the veterans of this country.
Hi, Rachel from CTV News. As Marie mentioned, a lot of people are calling this a demotion, but why do you think you were the one that was picked to come into this Veterans Affairs post?
Well, I will say again that I am proud to be the Veterans Affairs Minister. I had the opportunity to meet again the Deputy Minister, whom I will be serving with. And again, I do not believe that anybody that serves in this role, that serves the veterans of our country, should be considered in any negative light. This is an extremely important role. Our veterans served our country, created the freedoms and the rights that we have, and they deserve significant and strong representation, and that's what I'm committed to doing.
Last question.
Hi, Mr. Chris Ryan, CBC. The Veterans Affairs portfolio has seen a lot of ministers. It's also seen a lot of tempestuousness from Canada's veterans. They understandably are an activist group with many strong feelings. What personal qualities can you bring to the job to speak to veterans, and what is your message to them? We didn't see you a lot at the bottom of the stairs, and I'm wondering, because you'd have to go and do outreach with them, what you'll bring, please.
Well, you didn't see me a lot at the bottom of the stairs because I was incredibly busy in my previous role. And that leads me into my answer to your question. I am going to be incredibly busy in the role as the Minister of Veterans Affairs. What do I bring to the role? What would I say to veterans? I will bring the same work commitment, the same passion, the same desire to ensure that we care for our veterans, that we hear our veterans, that we have compassion for our veterans, and that we most importantly respect our veterans. And I will continue to do as much outreach to hear from them how we can serve them in the most appropriate and best way we can, because that is what they deserve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Listening there to some familiar faces in Jody Wilson-Raybould, certainly, who will move over to that Veterans Affairs portfolio. And we will hear from other names who were shuffled around. You could say it's your Monday morning shuffle from the government. We are about 10 months away from a federal election. So